One possibility of being of Dasein is to give ontic information about itself as a being. Such information is possible only in the disclosedness belonging to Dasein, which is based on attunement and understanding. What extent is anxiety a distinctive attunement? How in anxiety is Dasein brought before itself in it through its own being, so that phenomenologically the being disclosed in anxiety is defined as such in its being, or adequate preparations can be made for doing so? With the intention of penetrating to the being of the totality of the structural whole, we shall take our point of departure from the concrete analysis of entanglement carried out in the last chapter. The absorption of Dasein in the they and in the world, taken care of, reveals something like a flight of Dasein from itself, as an authentic potentiality for being itself. This phenomenon of the flight of Dasein from itself and its authenticity seems, however, to be least appropriate to serve as a phenomenal foundation for the following inquiry. In this flight, Dasein precisely does not bring itself before itself. In accordance with its almost trait of entanglement, this turning away leads away from Dasein. But in investigating such phenomena, our inquiry must guard against conflating ontic existential characteristics with ontological existential interpretation, and must not overlook the positive, phenomenal foundations provided for this interpretation by such a characterization. It is true that existentially the authenticity of being a self is closed off and pushed away in entanglement, but this closing off is only the privation of a disclosedness which reveals itself phenomenally in the fact that the flight of Dasein is a flight from itself. That from which Dasein flees is precisely what Dasein comes up behind. Only because Dasein is ontologically and essentially brought before itself by the disclosedness belonging to it, can it flee from that from which it flees. Of course, in this entangled turning away, that from which it flees is not grasped, nor is it experienced in a turning toward it. But in turning away from it, it is there disclosed. On account of its character of being disclosed, this existentialiontic turning away makes it phenomenally possible to grasp existentially and ontologically what the flight is from. Within the ontic away from, which lies in turning away, that from which Dasein flees can be understood and conceptualized by turning toward, in a way which is phenomenologically interpretive. Thus, the orientation of our analysis toward the phenomenon of entanglement is not condemned in principle to be without any prospect of ontologically experiencing something about the Dasein disclosed in that phenomenon. On the contrary, it is precisely here that our interpretation is the least likely to be surrendered to an artificial self-conception of Dasein. It only carries out the explication of what Dasein itself discloses ontic. The possibility of penetrating to the being of Dasein by going along with it and pursuing it interpretatively in an attuned understanding increases, the more primordially that phenomenon is which functions methodologically as disclosive attunement. Say that anxiety accomplishes something like this is only an assertion for now. We are not completely unprepared for the analysis of anxiety. It is true that we are still in the dark as to how it is ontologically connected with fear. Obviously, they are kindred phenomena. What tells us this is the fact that both phenomena remain mostly undifferentiated, and we designate as anxiety what is really fear, and call fear what has the character of anxiety. We shall attempt to penetrate to the phenomenon of anxiety step by step. The falling prey of Dasein to the they and the world, taken care of, we called a flight from itself. But not every shrinking back from, not every turning away from is necessarily a flight. Shrinking back from what fear discloses, from what is threatening, is founded upon fear and has the character of flight. Our interpretation of fear as attunement showed that what we fear is always a detrimental innerworldly being, approaching nearby from a definite region, which may remain absent. In falling prey, Dasein turns away from itself. What it shrinks back from must have a threatening character, yet this being has the same kind of being as the one which shrinks back from it. It is Dasein itself. What it shrinks back from cannot be grasped as something fearsome, because anything fearsome is always encountered as an innerworldly being. The only threat which can be fearsome, and which is discovered in fear, always comes from innerworldly being. The turning away of falling prey is thus not a flight which is based on a fear of innerworldly being. Any flight based on that kind of fear belongs still less to turning away, as turning away precisely turns toward innerworldly beings while absorbing itself in. The turning away of falling prey is rather based on anxiety, which in turn first makes fear possible. In order to understand this talk about the entangled flight of Dasein from itself, we must recall that being in the world is the basic constitution of Dasein. That about which one has anxiety is being in the world as such. How is what anxiety is anxious about phenomenally differentiated from what fear is afraid of? What anxiety is about is not an inner-worldly being. Thus it essentially cannot have any relevance beyond. The threat does not have the character of a definite harmfulness, which concerns what is threatened with a definite regard to a particular factical potentiality for being. What anxiety is about is completely indefinite. This indefiniteness not only leaves factically undecided which inner-worldly being is threatening, it also means that inner-worldly beings in general are not relevant. Nothing which is at hand and present within the world functions as that which anxiety is anxious about. The totality of relevance discovered within the world of things at hand and objectively present is completely without importance on belang. It collapses into itself. The world has the character of complete insignificance unbedeutsamkeit. In anxiety we do not encounter this or that thing which, as threatening, could be relevant. Thus neither does anxiety see a definite there and over here from which what is threatening approaches. The fact that what is threatening is nowhere characterizes what anxiety is about. Anxiety does not know what it is anxious about. But nowhere does not mean nothing, rather, region in general lies therein, and disclosedness of the world in general for essentially spatial being. Therefore, what is threatening cannot come closer from a definite direction within nearness. It is already there, and yet nowhere. It is so near that it is oppressive and takes away one's breath, and yet it is nowhere. What anxiety is about, the it is nothing and nowhere, becomes manifest. The recalcitrance of the inner-worldly nothing and nowhere means phenomenally that what anxiety is about is the world as such. The utter insignificance which makes itself known in the nothing and nowhere does not signify the absence of world, but means that inner-worldly beings in themselves are so completely unimportant that, on the basis of this insignificance of what is inner-worldly, the world in its worldliness is all that obtrudes itself. What crowds in upon us is not this or that, nor is it everything objectively present together as a sum, but the possibility of things at hand in general, that is, the world itself. When anxiety has subsided, in our everyday way of talking we are accustomed to say, it was really nothing. This way of talking, indeed, gets at what it was ontically. Everyday discourse aims at taking care of things at hand and talking about them. That about which anxiety is anxious is not NCHTS, inner-worldly things at hand. But this not nichts anything at hand, which is all that everyday, circumspect discourse understands, is not completely nothing nichts. The nothing of handiness is grounded in the primordial something et was in the world. The world, however, ontologically belongs essentially to the being of Dasein as being in the world. So if what anxiety is about exposes nothing, that is, the world as such, this means that that about which anxiety is anxious is being in the world itself. Being anxious discloses, primordially and directly, the world as world. It is not the case that initially we deliberately look away from inner-worldly beings and think only of the world about which anxiety arises, but anxiety, as a mode of attunement, first discloses the world as world. However, that does not mean that the worldliness of the world is grasped begriffen in anxiety. Anxiety is not only anxiety about, but is at the same time, as attunement, anxiety for. That for which anxiety is anxious is not a definite kind of being and possibility of Dasein. The threat itself is, after all, indefinite and thus cannot penetrate threateningly to this, or that factically concrete potentiality of being. What anxiety is anxious for is being in the world itself. In anxiety, the things at hand in the surrounding world sink away, and so do inner-worldly beings in general. The world can offer nothing more, nor can the Dasein with of others. Thus anxiety takes away from Dasein the possibility of understanding itself, falling prey, in terms of the world, and the public way of being interpreted. It throws Dasein back upon that for which it is anxious, its authentic potentiality for being in the world. Anxiety individuates Dasein to its almost being in the world, which, as understanding, projects itself essentially upon possibility. Thus, along with that for which it is anxious, anxiety discloses Dasein as being possible, and indeed as what, solely einzig from itself, can be individualized in individuation varianzella. Anxiety reveals in Dasein its being toward its almost potentiality of being, that is, being free for the freedom of choosing and grasping itself. Anxiety brings Dasein before its being free for, propensio in, the authenticity of its being as possibility which it always already is. But at the same time, It is this being to which Dasein as being enthralled is entrusted. That about which anxiety is anxious reveals itself as that for which it is anxious, being in the world. The sameness selbigkeit of that about which, and that for which one has anxiety extends even to anxiousness itself. For as attunement, anxiousness is a fundamental mode of being in the world. The existential sameness of disclosing, and what is disclosed, so that in what is disclosed the world is disclosed as world, as being in, individualized, pure, thrown potentiality for being, makes it clear that with the phenomenon of anxiety, a distinctive kind of attunement has become the theme of our interpretation. Anxiety individualizes, and thus discloses Dasein as solus ipse. This existential solipsism, however, is so far from transposing an isolated subject thing into the harmless vacuum of a worldless occurrence that it brings Dasein in an extreme sense precisely before its world as world, and thus itself before itself as being in the world. Again, everyday discourse and the everyday interpretation of Dasein furnish the most unbiased evidence that anxiety as a basic attunement is disclosive in this way. We said earlier that attunement reveals how one is. In anxiety one has an uncanny, unheimlich feeling. Here, with anxiety, the peculiar indefiniteness of that which Dasein finds itself involved in anxiety initially finds expression, the nothing and nowhere. But uncanniness means at the same time not being at home. In our first phenomenal indication of the fundamental constitution of Dasein, and the clarification of the existential meaning of being in contradistinction to the categorical signification of insideness, being in was defined as dwelling with. Being familiar, this characteristic of being in, was then made more concretely visible through the everyday publicness of the they which brings tranquilized self-assurance being at home. Zu sein, with all its obviousness, into the average everydayness of Dasein 3 anxiety, on the other hand, fetches Dasein back out of its entangled absorption in the world. Everyday familiarity collapses. Dasein is individualized Vereinzel, but as being in the world. Being in enters the existential mode of not being at home unzuhos. The talk about uncanniness, Unheimlichkeit means nothing other than this. Now, however, what falling prey as flight is fleeing from becomes phenomenally visible. It is not a flight from inner-worldly beings, but precisely toward them as the beings among which taking care of things, lost in the they, can linger in tranquilized familiarity. Entangled flight into the being at home of publicness is flight from not being at home, that is, from the uncanniness which lies in Dasein as throne, as being in the world entrusted to itself in its being. This uncanniness constantly pursues Dasein and threatens its everyday lostness in the they, although not explicitly. This threat can factically go along with the complete security and self-sufficiency of the everyday way of taking care. Anxiety can arise in the most harmless situation. Nor does it have any need for darkness, in which things usually become uncanny to us more easily. In the dark there is emphatically nothing to see, although the world is still there more obtrusively. If we interpret the uncanniness of Dasein existentially and ontologically as a threat which concerns Dasein itself, and which comes from Dasein itself, we are not asserting that uncanniness has always already been understood in factical anxiety in this sense. The everyday way in which Dasein understands uncanniness is the entangled turning away which dims down, not being at home. The everydayness of this fleeing, however, shows phenomenally that anxiety as a fundamental kind of attunement belongs to Dasein's essential constitution as being in the world, which, as an existential, is never objectively present, but is itself always in the mode of factical Dasein, that is, in the mode of an attunement. Tranquilized, familiar being in the world is a mode of the uncanniness of Dasein, not the other way around. Not being at home must be conceived existentially and ontologically as the more primordial phenomenon. And only because anxiety always already latently determines being in the world, can being in the world, as being together with the world, taking care of things and attuned, be afraid. Fear is anxiety which has fallen prey to the world. It is inauthentic and concealed from itself as such. Factically, the mood of uncanniness remains for the most part existentially uncomprehended. Moreover, with the dominance of falling prey in publicness, real, eigentliche anxiety is rare. Often anxiety is physiologically conditioned. This fact is an ontological problem in its facticity, not only with regard to its ontic causes and course of development. The physiological triggering of anxiety is possible only because Dasein is anxious in the very ground of its being. Still more rare than the existential fact of real anxiety are the attempts to interpret this phenomenon in its fundamental, existential ontological constitution and function. The reasons for this lie partly in the general neglect of the existential analytic of Dasein, particularly in the failure to recognize the phenomenon of the factical rarity of the phenomenon of anxiety, however, cannot deprive it of its suitability for taking over a methodical function in principle for the existential analytic. On the contrary, the rarity of the phenomenon is an indication of the fact that Dasein, which mostly remains concealed from itself in its authenticity, because of the way things get publicly interpreted by the they, can be disclosed in a primordial sense in its fundamental attunement. It is true that it is the nature of every kind of attunement to disclose complete being in the world in all its constitutive factors, world, being in, self. However, in anxiety there lies the possibility of a distinctive disclosure, since anxiety individualizes. This individuality fetches Dasein back from its falling prey, and reveals to it authenticity and inauthenticity as possibilities of its being. The fundamental possibilities of Dasein, which are always might show themselves in anxiety as they are, undisguised unversed by inner-worldly beings to which Dasein, initially and for the most part, cling. What extent has this existential interpretation of anxiety gained a phenomenal basis for answering the leading question of the being of the totality of the structural whole of Dasein? Section 41. The being of Dasein is care with the intention of grasping the totality of the structural whole ontologically. We must first ask whether the phenomenon of anxiety and what is disclosed in it are able to give us the whole of Dasein in a way that is phenomenally equiprimordial, so that our search for totality can be fulfilled in this givenness. The complete inventory of what lies in it can be enumerated. As attunement, being anxious is a way of being in the world. That about which we have anxiety is thrown being in the world. That for which we have anxiety is our potentiality for being in the world. The complete phenomenon of anxiety thus shows Dasein as factical, existing being in the world. The fundamental, ontological characteristics of this being are existentiality, facticity, and falling prey. These existential determinations are not pieces belonging to something composite, one of which might sometimes be missing, but a primordial coherence, Zusammenhang, is woven in them which constitutes the totality of the structural whole that we are seeking. In the unity of the determinations of the being of Dasein that we have mentioned, its being becomes ontologically comprehensible as such. How is this unity itself to be characterized? Dasein is a being which is concerned in its being about that being. The is concerned about has become clearer in the constitution of being of understanding as self-projective, being toward its own most potentiality for being. This potentiality is that for the sake of which any Dasein is as it is. Dasein has always already compared itself, in its being, with a possibility of itself. Being free for its own most potentiality for being, and thus for the possibility of authenticity and inauthenticity, shows itself in a primordial, elemental concretion in anxiety. But ontologically, being toward one's own most potentiality for being means that Dasein is always already ahead of itself in its being. Dasein is always already beyond itself, not as a way of behaving toward beings which it is not, but as being toward the potentiality for being which it itself is. This structure of being of the essential, being concerned about, we formulate as the being ahead of itself of Dasein. But this structure concerns the whole of the constitution of Dasein. Being ahead of itself does not mean anything like an isolated tendency in a worldless subject, but characterizes being in the world. But to being in the world belongs the fact that it is entrusted ilberant retet to itself, that it is always already thrown into a world. The fact that Dasein is left to itself, Überlassenheit, shows itself primordially and concretely in anxiety. More completely formulated, being ahead of itself means being ahead of itself and already being in a world. As soon as this essentially unitary structure is seen phenomenally, what we worked out earlier in the analysis of worldliness also becomes clear. There we found that the referential totality of significance, which is constitutive for worldliness, is anchored in a for the sake of which. The fact that this referential totality of the manifold relations of the in order to is bound up with that which Dasein is concerned about does not signify that an objectively present world of objects is welded together with a subject. Rather, it is the phenomenal expression of the fact that the constitution of Dasein, whose wholeness is now delineated explicitly as being ahead of itself and already being in, is primordially a whole. Expressed differently, existing is always factical. Existentiality is essentially determined by facticity. Furthermore, the factical existing of Dasein is not only in general and indifferently a thrown potentiality for being in the world, but is always already also absorbed in the world taken care of. In this entangled being together with, fleeing from uncanniness, which mostly remains covered over by latent anxiety because the publicness of the they suppresses everything unfamiliar, announces itself, whether it does so explicitly or not, and whether it is understood or not. Entangled being together with inner-worldly things at hand, taken care of, is essentially included in being ahead of oneself already being in the world. The formal existential totality of the ontological structural whole of Dasein must thus be formulated in the following structure. The being of Dasein means being ahead of oneself already in the world, as being together with inner-worldly beings encounter. This being fills in the significance of the term care, which is used in a purely ontological and existential way. Any ontically intended tendency of being, such as worry or carefreeness, is ruled out. Since being in the world is essentially care, being together with things at hand could be taken in our previous analyses as taking care of them, while being with the Dasein with of others encountered within the world could be taken as concern. Being together with is taking care, because as a mode of being in, it is determined by its fundamental structure, care. Care not only characterizes existentiality, abstracted from facticity and falling prey, but encompasses the unity of these determinations of being. Nor does care mean primarily and exclusively an isolated attitude of the ego toward itself. The expression care for oneself, following the analogy of taking care and concern, would be a tautology. Care cannot mean a special attitude toward the self, because the self is already characterized ontologically as being ahead of itself. But in this determination, the other two structural moments of care, already being in and being together with, are co-posited mitgeset. In being ahead of oneself, as the being toward one's own most potentiality of being, lies the existential and ontological condition of the possibility of being free for authentic existential possibility. It is the potentiality for being for the sake of which Dasein always is, as it factically is. But since this being toward the potentiality for being is itself determined by freedom, Dasein can also be related to its possibilities unwillingly. It can be inauthentic and factically it is this initially, and for the most part. The authentic for the sake of, which remains ungrasped, the project of one's potentiality of being is left to the disposal of the they. Thus in being ahead of itself, the self actually means the self in the sense of the they-self. Even in inauthenticity, Dasein remains essentially ahead of itself, just as the entangled fleeing of Dasein from itself still shows the constitution of a being that is concerned about its being. As a primordial structural totality, care lies before every factical attitude and position of Dasein, that is, it is always already in them as an existential a priori. Thus this phenomenon by no means expresses a priority of practical over theoretical behavior. When we determine something objectively present by merely looking at it, this has the character of care just as much as a political action, or resting and having a good time. Theory and praxis are possibilities of being for a being whose being must be defined as care. The phenomenon of care in its totality is essentially something that cannot be split up. Thus any attempts to derive it from special acts or drives, such as willing and wishing or urge and predilection, or of constructing it out of them, will be unsuccessful. Willing and wishing are necessarily rooted ontologically in Dasein as care, and are not simply ontologically undifferentiated experiences, which occur in a stream that is completely indeterminate as to the meaning of its being. This is no less true for predilection and urge. They too are based upon care insofar as they are purely demonstrable in Dasein in general. This does not exclude the fact that urge and predilection are ontologically constitutive even for beings which are only alive. The basic ontological constitution of life, however, is a problem in its own right, and can be developed only reductively and privatively in terms of the ontology of Dasein. Care is ontologically prior to the phenomena we mentioned, which can, of course, always be adequately described, within certain limits without the complete ontological horizon needing to be visible or even known as such. For the present fundamental ontological study, which neither aspires to a thematically complete ontology of Dasein nor even to a concrete anthropology, it must suffice to suggest how these phenomena are existentially grounded in care. The potentiality for being for the sake of which Dasein is, has itself the mode of being in the world. Accordingly, the relation to inner-worldly beings lies in it ontologically. Even if only privately, care is always taking care and concern. In willing, a being that is understood, that is, projected upon its possibility, is grasped as something to be taken care of or to be brought to its being through concern. For this reason, to any willing there always belongs something willed, and this thing willed has already been determined in terms of a for the sake of, which. If willing is to be possible ontologically, the following factors are constitutive for it: the previous disclosedness of the for the sake of, which in general being ahead of oneself, the disclosedness of what can be taken care of, world as the wherein of already being, and the understanding self-projection of Dasein upon a potentiality for being toward a possibility of the being, will. The underlying wholeness of care shows through in the phenomenon of willing. As something factical, the understanding self-projection of Dasein is always already together with a discovered world. From this world it takes its possibilities, initially in accordance with the interpretedness of the they. This interpretation has from the outset restricted the possible options of choice to the scope of what is familiar, attainable, feasible, to what is correct and proper. The leveling down of the possibilities of Dasein to what is initially available in an everyday way at the same time results in a phasing out of the possible as such. The average everydayness of taking care of things becomes blind to possibility and gets tranquilized with what is merely real. This tranquilization not only does not rule out a high degree of busyness in taking care of things, rather, it arouses it. It is not the case that positive, new possibilities are then willed, but what is available is tactically changed in such a way that there is an illusion of something happening. All the same, under the leadership of the they, this tranquilized willing does not signify that being toward one's potentiality for being has been extinguished, but only that it has been modified. Being toward possibilities then shows itself for the most part as mere wishing. In the wish, Dasein projects its being toward possibilities which not only remain ungrasped in taking care of things, but whose fulfillment is not even thought about and expected. On the contrary, the predominance of being ahead of itself in the mode of mere wishing brings with it a lack of understanding of factical possibility. Being in the world whose world is primarily projected as a wish world has lost itself utterly in what is available, but in such a way that in the light of what is wished for, what is available, all the things at hand, is never enough. Wishing is an existential modification of understanding self-projection which, having fallen prey to thrownness, simply indulges in possibility. Such indulgence closes off possibilities. What is there in such wishful indulgence becomes the real world. Ontologically, wishing presupposes care. An indulgence, being in the world already among, has priority. Being ahead of itself and already being in, is modified accordingly. Entangled indulgence reveals the inclination of Dasein to be lived by the world in which it is. This inclination shows the character of being out for something. Being ahead of itself has gotten lost in a just always already among. That toward which one is inclined is a letting oneself be attracted by the sort of thing in which the inclination loses itself. When Dasein, so to speak, sinks down into an inclination, then it is not just an inclination that is present, rather, the complete structure of care is modified. Blinded, it puts all possibilities in the service of the inclination. On the other hand, the urge to live is a toward, which brings its own drive along with it. It is toward at any cost. Urge seeks to crowd out other possibilities. Here, too, being ahead of oneself is inauthentic if one is invaded by an urge coming from the very thing that is urging one on. The urge can outrun one's actual attunement and understanding. But Dasein is not then and never is a mere urge, to which other relations of dominating and leading are sometimes added, but as a modification of complete being in the world, it is always already care. In pure urge, care has not yet become free, although it first makes it ontologically possible for Dasein to be urged on by itself. On the other hand, in an inclination care is always already bound. Inclination and urge are possibilities rooted in the thrownness of Dasein. The urge to live is not to be destroyed, the inclination to be lived by the world is not to be eradicated. But because, and only because they are ontologically based in care, both are to be modified ontically and existentially by care as something authentic. The expression care means an existential and basic ontological phenomenon, which nevertheless is not simple in its structure. This ontologically elemental totality of the care structure cannot be reduced to an ontic primal element, just as being certainly cannot be explained in terms of being. Finally, we shall see that the idea of being in general is no more simple than the being of Dasein. The characterization of care as being ahead of itself and already being in us, being told therewith makes clear that this phenomenon, too, is still structurally articulated in itself. But is that not a phenomenal indication that the ontological question must be pursued still further, until we can set forth a still more primordial phenomenon which ontologically supports the unity and totality of the structural manifold of care? Before we follow up this question, we need to look back and appropriate more precisely what has been interpreted up to now with the intention of seeing the fundamental ontological question of the meaning of being in general. First, we must show that what is ontologically new in this interpretation is ontically rather old. The explication of the being of Dasein as care does not force Dasein under a contrived idea, but brings us existentially to a concept which has already been disclosed ontically and existentially.